because it's willing to acknowledge there are a lot of men who are toxic in various ways, not because of the Christian theology, but because of the secular script. Men are called to this very rich understanding of building up the whole social world. But men are also called to be culture creators. The person who did the largest study was a sociologist named Brad Wilcox. He said, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages.
Hey there, you're listening to the Upside Down People podcast. This is a podcast where we have gospel-centered conversations with Jesus-loving people. Whether you're a regular friend of the show or a first-time friend, I'm so glad you're here with us today. And if you're enjoying the conversations, please be sure to subscribe at Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave it a review. In today's conversation, I sit down with Professor Nancy Pearcey and have a conversation around the toxic war on masculinity. Nancy Pearcey is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and Total Truth. She is a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University, and she has been quoted in The New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today, and hailed in The Economist as America's pre-eminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. With that said, let's jump into today's episode. Welcome to the show, Professor Pearcey. So pleased to be having a conversation with you today.
Thank you. I appreciate you inviting me.
Yeah, I'm just really overwhelmed and joyed that I get to have this conversation with you around your recent book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. Any of my friends who know me have known I've really anticipated this conversation because you've spoken to some amazing thinkers and authors that I really enjoy, and I really enjoy your work as well. So thanks for carving out the time.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's good. It's good to have a chance to talk with you and to sort of get to know your audience over there in Australia, which is very impressive.
Yes, yeah, all the way on the other side of the pond, as they say. So I thought a good place to start would just be to get to know you a bit. So if you can share a bit about your background, how you ended up doing what you're doing, and what you're currently doing.
Oh, well, if you don't mind, I'll tell you how I became a Christian, because I think that's the most important part of my background.
That'd be amazing. Yeah, please do.
Because I have found the older I get, the more thankful I am that God got a hold of me. I'm starting to use it now. Every time I get invited to do public speaking, I include my conversion story, which I didn't used to do. But I was raised in a Christian home. It was a Lutheran home, and I don't know if you know this, but all Scandinavians are Lutheran. It was a state church. And so my dad's Swedish, my mom's Norwegian, and so it was very much of an ethnic upbringing, kind of like all Irish or Catholic.
Right.
But the problem with an ethnic background like that is that parents often rely on the ethnicity to hold their children. And there wasn't a really strong personal conviction in their Christian faith. And so when I was in high school, I just started asking questions. How do we know it's true? It was really just one question.
Yeah.
How do we know Christianity is true? You know, I'm attending a public high school. All my teachers are secular. All my textbooks are secular. And I just wanted to know, how do we know that Christianity is true over against all of these other secular ideas I'm running into? And unfortunately, my parents could not answer that question. Their response was kind of like, well, we're Swedish, what else are you going to be?
Right.
I talked to a university professor, and he said, I asked him point blank, why are you a Christian? He said, works for me. And I thought, really? That's it? I even had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, and all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes, as if it was a psychological phase that I was going through. And so but halfway through high school, I said, I guess Christianity doesn't have any answers. And I thought of it as a matter of intellectual honesty, that if you don't have good reasons for something, you shouldn't say you believe it. whether it's Christianity or anything. And I clearly had no good reasons and was not finding any. So I very intentionally walked away from my Christian upbringing. And I realized quickly, though, that if there was no God, then there was no foundation for ethics. Moral relativism is just true for me, true for you. I realized there was no particular meaning or purpose to life. We're just thrown up out of the primal pond, right, by random chance. There's not even a foundation for knowledge. Yeah. Here's how I thought of it. If all I have is my puny brain and the vast scope of time and history, what makes me think I could have some sort of transcendent universal truth? Ridiculous.
Right.
So by the time I graduated from high school, I was a complete relativist, skeptic. I was even a determinist because in my science classes, I learned that we were just complex biochemical machines anyway.
Right.
So I had completely absorbed all of these secularisms. And as a result, the only thing that really would speak to me was apologetics. And I managed to run into Francis Schaeffer's ministry, which was an apologetics ministry. Right. And I kind of stumbled across it. I didn't intend to go there. People sometimes say, well, why would you go to a Christian ministry if you weren't a Christian? Well, the answer is I actually had some family members who were visiting there, right, and said, hey, come see us. We're at L'Abri. Francis Schaeffer's ministry was called L'Abri. It was in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. So anyway, that was the first time that I encountered any kind of Christian apologetics, and I was blown away. I just had no idea that Christianity could be defended by good reasons and arguments, and that it could hold its own against the secularisms, right, that I had absorbed by that time. So people say you can't argue anyone into the kingdom, but it was pretty much of an intellectual conversion in the sense that I realized, well, Christianity just has better answers to the basic philosophical questions, that all worldviews seek to answer. And, I found out that I was intellectually persuaded, wow, that it was a better worldview. So, now of course the personal side of it came later, but the initial conversion was pretty much just, well, philosophically it makes better sense.
Yeah, you're convinced of that. And I love how, as you're speaking in terms of when you're going through that cognitive sort of stage of trying to figure out what is truth and sort of sifting through that postmodern, like everything is relative. And it reminded me of a quote, I think it was by Dostoevsky, who says, without God, everything is permissible, which is so true. If you don't have that moral value, then everything does go right. You can sort of be swayed by the tides of our time.
Yeah, if there's no objective, universal, transcendent moral standard, then all we really have is true for me, true for you. And when I was in high school, I was the one in my friend group who was arguing for moral relativism at the time. A friend of mine says, oh, she's so wrong. And I'm the one who jumps in and says, no, you can't say anyone's right or wrong. So that when I did become a Christian, it was a really dramatic conversion. I really had a complete switch in worldview. And that's why I write and speak and teach about apologetics to this day. What I teach here at Houston Christian University. We just changed our name from Houston Baptist. I teach apologetics. All my books are some form of apologetics. So it's like I would really like to help young people who had the kind of questions I had when I was young.
Brilliant. And I think it's so needed, especially in this day and age. And obviously your book Love Thy Body was a bestseller, and then you've just recently wrote Toxic War on Masculinity. So maybe you can give us a snapshot into what Toxic War of Masculinity is all about, and why you felt the need to write it.
Well, my eye was caught originally by just seeing how socially acceptable it's become to attack masculinity, to express hostility. Here was an example. The Washington Post had an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" I thought, really? In a respected mainline publication like that? The Huffington Post had an editor who tweeted, #KillAllMen.
Wow.
You can buy T-shirts that say, "So many men, so little ammunition."
Oh.
As though that were a joke. And there are books with titles that are very blunt, like I Hate Men and No Good Men and Are Men Necessary? So I just wanted to get to the bottom of this. Where's this coming from? Oh, and even men sometimes jump on the bandwagon. So there was a fairly well-known male author wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer.
Right.
And then this came out. It came out after my book, so it's not in there. But the director of the movie Avatar was in the news because he said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So even men are willing to say there's something wrong with masculinity, and that was the first thing I wanted to do in the book, is just say, where is this coming from? You cannot stand against a social trend unless you really say, investigate, where did it come from? How did it develop? So that was my initial goal. It's just, how can we give people better tools to respond to this?
Yeah, and I think you do a brilliant job of that. I think one thing I did notice about the book is it's so rich, full of data, and it's very evidence driven. And you start off the book by giving a very honest, vulnerable account of your own story, and then you go into sharing a bit about how men are being torn between these two competing narratives for masculinity. Maybe you could share a bit about what those narratives are.
Yeah, so I start the book with the story of my own upbringing, because my father was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they will sometimes ask, was it open hand or closed fist? And it was closed fist. My father was punching and kicking us. And so, in a sense, what I put in my introduction is, in a sense, I've been writing this book my whole life, because it's taken that long to really work through a positive, biblical, healthy view of masculinity. Of course, as I grew up as a young adult, I ricocheted into extreme feminism. Was a very strong feminist for many years, because, of course, I thought men were evil. And then I became a Christian and had to work all this through from the beginning again. So that's a big part of this. The book it's not coming. Well, here's how one Christian psychologist put it. He interviewed me on the book, and he said, at least we know you're not writing from an ivory tower. Right. You're writing from the trenches.
Yeah.
So, I didn't have a privileged, comfortable, loving, secure childhood to be writing the song. But the study that you mentioned is one that I put right at the beginning of the book. And I'll tell you why I had to put it there, because this part's not in the book. It's a little bit of background. It turns out it's the most controversial book I've ever written.
Right.
Which surprised me, because, Love Thy Body was about homosexuality, transgenderism, abortion, these cutting-edge issues. But at least in the Christian world, this one, the word masculinity triggers people.
Right.
And when I write my books, I always do a lot of reading groups, to try to rub off the rough edges. And when they told their friends and family we were going through a book on masculinity, invariably the first question was, whose side is she on?
Right.
You had to pick a side. Men tended to assume that a woman writing a book on masculinity would be a male-bashing feminist.
Right.
And more progressive types tended to assume I was a defensive, reactionary culture warrior. And so what I did in the book is, this opening study showed that you don't have to be for or against masculinity wholesale. There are two different scripts. And it was, the study was done by a sociologist who gets invited to speak all around the world. He's very famous. And so he came up with this ingenious experiment where he would ask young men two questions. First, he would say, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And the sociologist said, all around the globe, young men had no trouble answering that. They would immediately start listing honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a protector, be a provider, be responsible. And the sociologist would say, where'd you learn that? And they would say, I don't know. It's just in the air we breathe.
Right.
Or, as I would say, they're made in God's image.
Yeah.
And so they do know what it means to be a good man. But then the sociologist would follow up with a second question, and he would say, what does it mean to you if I say man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, oh, no, that's completely different.
Right.
That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. And so he concluded that men do have this innate, inherent knowledge to what it means to be a good man. We might say, too, it's part of general revelation. It's what people pick up just with being made in God's image, living in God's world, as apart from special revelation, which is the Bible. This is something, because these studies were not done just in countries with a Christian background.
Right.
By the way, when he was in a Western country, and he asked, where did you get that? They would often say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage.
Oh, interesting.
But they weren't unique. What was it? It was global. It was universal. But in many cultures, men also feel pressure to be, what he called the real man. Man up, be the real man. And those traits are quite different. Those traits can, if they get separated, if they get decoupled from a moral vision, they can slide into more toxic traits like entitlement and dominance and control. And so it was, once people got over that, when they read through the study, they said, okay. I see now I can be for the good man. I can support that. I can try that, draw that out while having a critical perspective on the real man, quote unquote. And people found that gave them a much more positive approach to these issues too, because most men don't respond very well to being called toxic.
Right.
So, not surprisingly. So it's a much better strategy to say, can we tap into this universal, inherent, innate sense of what it means to be a good man?
Right.
Can we support and encourage and affirm that? And that gives us a much better way to approach these issues.
Yeah, very good. So interestingly, how then as a culture do we identify, or in terms of a gospel culture, how do we identify traits that are inherent to the male nature as God created it? And how do we distinguish between that whole idea that you develop in the book, the software and the virus?
Yeah, well, I like the words you use when you said it's very data-driven, very evidence-driven, because unlike most books on masculinity, most books are kind of devotional books for men, Christian living. And what I thought was, I'm not just gonna give a like a Bible study on masculinity or quote the Christian leaders. I want to find out how real ordinary Christians live it out, because there have been a lot of studies done on ordinary Christians, what they think the scripture means when it says, when it speaks of male headship in the home, for example. And of course, as you know, Christians often set up as exhibit A of toxic masculinity. They're often considered the worst. I'll give you just one example. It was easy to find examples, but this was a co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. Yeah, that's pretty strong. And so, but what happened is the social scientists were reading these kinds of accusations and saying, where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And I quote some dozen or so studies in my book where they found out that Christian men who attend church regularly, who are sincere and committed in their faith, test out as the most loving husbands and fathers. They test out at the top.
Wow.
Their wives test out as reporting the highest level of happiness with their husband's love and affection. Evangelical fathers spend the most time with their kids, 3.5 hours more per week than secular fathers. Evangelical couples divorce at a lower rate than secular couples, 35% lower. And then they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence. And so instead of looking at, what the leaders say we should do, I went to look at what Christian men actually do, when they're living out a Christian vision. And I was blown away. I have to tell you, I did not expect that. I've read the same media stereotypes that you have, and thought that I would find that Christian men were sort of domineering, overbearing patriarchs. And I did not expect to find that when they were actually surveyed, that they would express such a loving, respectful, mutual, supportive understanding of what it means to be the head of the home. Headship and submission, the definitions that they were living out. That's when you say, well, what is the biblical view? I kind of answered it by saying, let's see what they do. Yeah. Let's see what Christians do. And they do test out as the most loving husbands and fathers. In fact, let me give you a quote, because sometimes the quote will really crystallize this. The person who did the largest study was a sociologist named Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature, he publishes in places like the New York Times, right, which is fairly rare for conservative Christians to get a foot in the door. So this is a quote from an article he wrote in the New York Times. He said, "It turns out," and this is a direct quote, "it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives." Of course, they focus on the wives because the assumption is that these marriages are oppressive to the wives.
Right.
But no, the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. And then he turns to his academic colleagues, who are mostly secular. Sociology is a very secular discipline. And he says academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and against evangelicals in particular, because evangelical Protestant married men with children are consistently the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. So this is what the data shows.
Right.
And I was just, like I say, I was blown away by it. And it's not a pep talk from a religious leader. This is solid empirical research. These are evidence-based findings, and we should be bold about bringing them both into the church and into the public square, to counter the secular narratives.
Yeah, and I do definitely agree with that. It's almost I think in your book you used the word nominal, like that, the difference between nominal Christians and then I'd say more committed Christians, and I think you get that. When you talk about male headship, you sort of look to Christ as the example, and he's the servant of all, right? And I think maybe that's a bit about why there is a difference in that people who are committed to following Jesus realize that the kingdom of God is this upside down kingdom. It's one where you supposed to serve and not. You're not ruling from on high. You're sort of coming down lowly. And I love that that's what the data shows in the sense of people who are following that. Their marriages are a lot better. Their kids are a lot healthier. So it's like you're saying, all the evidence points to that, which is I just find fascinating myself as well, because I would have expected the other.
Yes, in fact, there was an article that came out just today. Let's talk about how up to date this is. An article came out today in the Institute for Family Studies, and it was looking at what marriages are happiest, and also they looked at the parent-child relationship, and they said it has nothing to do with education, with wealth or poverty, social class, or anything else, but it did have to do with conservative versus liberal. And they said conservative families their marriages test out as happier, and their children, parent-child relationships test out as happier. So if you want to see the latest research, just today, Institute for Family Studies. But you mentioned the nominals, and I think that's important because a lot of the negative stereotypes are actually being generated by people who are interacting with nominal Christians. Right. That my students don't even know what that word means, so I have to explain to them. N-O-M is Latin for name, so nominal means in name only. And so these are men who, on a survey like this, might check the Baptist box, for example, but in fact, they attend church rarely, if at all.
Right.
And they test out dramatically different. In fact, they fit all the negative stereotypes of toxic masculinity. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They spend the least amount of their time with their children. They divorce at a higher rate even than secular men, 20% higher than secular couples. And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, even higher than secular men.
Wow.
And so this is what we're up against in the church, right? On the one hand, we've got men who are doing much better than the rest of the society, who are testing out on top. And we need to be encouraged, by the way.
Yeah.
But I have a student who works for a very large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out flowers and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. So I think we need to stop scolding, bring this data into the church so that men who are doing a good job can be encouraged and supported. But then what do we do about these men who are sort of nominal and at the fringes of the Christian world, who are using the Christian language of headship and submission, but are infusing those words with secular meanings? They're taking their meanings from the secular world, the secular script for masculinity, the real man, as that earlier study put it.
Right.
And then ending up even worse than secular men. But some people have said, why would they be worse? Well, apparently, the average secular guy who may be hitting his wife and kids at least doesn't feel religious justification for it. But the nominal Christian does. So he's living like a secular man, but he's justifying it with biblical language and then ending up being even worse in his behavior. So this is a huge challenge, I would think, for the church, is how do we reach out and have a more effective discipleship program for this large number of nominals. In the West, we do have a lot of nominal Christians.
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge challenge that the church has not recognized yet, because we didn't have these studies. Now that we have these studies, we know that we've got the best and the worst. So how does the church minister to both ends of the spectrum?
Yeah, great. And that's something, I suppose, awareness should bring change as well. So I love how those studies have come out as well. Just moving on slightly in terms of in Western contexts, particularly in my generation, so millennials and perhaps Gen Zs as well, there's been a popularization of this idea of alpha versus beta males. I don't know if you've come across that or heard it. I'm sure you would have. But my question would be, what are your thoughts on these male identity constructions? And are they helpful or harmful in the pursuit for real, authentic masculinity?
Yeah, that's a good question, because boys have been falling behind for quite some time. Boys have been falling behind in education. Starting in kindergarten, they don't have as good fine motor control as girls, and so they can't handle scissors as well.
Sorry. I was just going to say, that's actually my primary school teacher went to my parents and said they wanted to hold me back for 2 years, my pre-primary school teacher, because of exactly that, because I didn't have fine motor skills developed yet. So yeah, my mum pushed and said, like, no, that's fine. But I just wanted to interrupt and say that is so true. I've experienced that.
That's good. That's good. I might use your story to illustrate in the future. Yes, this is not just the books. This is real people have had this experience. And the boys are falling behind in both test scores and grades all the way through high school. They're falling behind in college. The average college now is 60% female, right. 40% male. And there are more women in graduate school and professional school as well. So this is it is a problem, and it's been called failure to launch, right? The boys falling behind, losing any sort of ambition, sitting in the mother's basement playing video games. But what I've seen lately is more the trend that you're just describing. The manosphere, right? The manosphere is the name for these online groups. That many times are somewhat misogynist and generating more of a hostile, defiant concept of masculinity. The Andrew Tate phenomenon, he's the best known.
Yeah.
So fast cars, fast money, fast women. I heard him in an interview where he said quite openly that he was a pimp and that he was producing pornography. And yet he's being held up by many young men because on the other hand, he does tell them, get going, get a job, make money, and get fit, right? Get physically fit. So I have one of my graduate students now teaches high school. And she wrote me an email saying all my male students are fans of Andrew Tate.
Right.
They're even using Andrew Tate quotes in their yearbook. I said, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school.
Right.
So even Christian young men are reaching out to these online influencers. And what they're doing, it's good that we started with that study, the good man versus the real man, because this is where it shows up, where the rubber hits the road. Andrew Tate is the real man. And so he has some of the appeal to young men of being sort of strong and confident, and they look up to him. And on the other hand, he's completely immoral, right? He's got lots of different women. He's got lots of different children from different women, none of whom he's parenting, of course.
Right.
And he argues explicitly that a man should not just have one woman, for goodness sakes. The assumption is that the male nature is just naturally promiscuous.
Right.
So obviously this is something that as Christians we can't affirm because it's immoral. By the way, the New York Post was just celebrating what they called the new Andrew Tate. His name is Myron Gaines, and his tagline is, "I help men transform from simps into pimps."
Huh.
And it's kind of the same appeal, he's tough and he's confident, but he argues again. He too says, "I'm never going to get married. A man should never settle for just one woman." Women just have to accept that this is the male nature. So what we have to understand is where that secular script comes from. And in my book, I spend several chapters actually sort of unfolding how the secular script for masculinity developed. And one of the key turning points, which I think is what we're seeing today, the key turning point was the rise of Darwinian evolution. And this was a bit of surprise because most of the time we think Darwin is about science.
Right.
But he had a huge impact on concepts of masculinity. Social Darwinists began to argue that the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would be ruthless, brutal, savage, barbarian, and sexually predatory.
Right.
And so the masculine ideal that was coming out of the secular world was this extremely negative view. And it's not just, in Darwin's day. Social Darwinism has come back in our own day. It's under a new label. It's called evolutionary psychology. But I'll give you two examples. One was a best-selling book called The Moral Animal. And the author says the human male is let's see if I can keep this quote right, a possessive, oppressive, flesh-obsessed pig. Giving a man a book on how to have a better marriage is like giving a Viking a booklet on how not to pillage.
Wow.
I thought, men are reading this? This is so demeaning. And then there's a second one. It's actually an older book that was just reissued called Men in Marriage. And he says the same thing. He says, men are by nature violent, irresponsible, sexually predatory. Their deepest yearning is to escape into the realm of primal and predatory gratification. Like, wait a minute. Do you see where Andrew Tate's coming from now? When the intellectuals of the world are writing things like this, of course, that's what filters down to young men who are looking for models of masculinity. And if they don't have the Christian biblical input, this is what they're going to gravitate toward. This is where the secular model of masculinity is these days.
Right. Yeah, that is very fascinating, and it's interesting how there can be those two competing narratives in society. One which is trying to dehumanize and deconstruct the male identity, and then the other, which is almost on the other end of the scale, trying to just say, well, I'll do what I want. If that's what if you want to repress me and put me down, then I'll show you how powerful I am, and it's really destructive in its own end, right?
Certainly. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, certainly, I agree with you.
Yeah, and all I was going to say from that is you in your book as well, it sort of leads into this idea of fatherlessness, or the absent fathers, and research shows that children from fatherless homes are more likely to be poor, become involved in drug and alcohol abuse, drop out of school, suffer from health and emotional problems. As you said, boys are more likely to become involved in all these different things, and girls are more likely to become pregnant as teens in a fatherless home. So the long-term strategy for preventing toxic behavior in men is for fathers to invest deeply into their children, into their sons. But the media portrays fathers as these incompetent sort of people. Where did this negative image come from? And I suppose, what are the practical steps that fathers can take to be more involved?
Yeah, everybody knows that fathers are ridiculed and mocked in the media, right? The Homer Simpson model, or I don't know if did you read the Berenstain Bears? One of my sons was really into the Berenstain Bears. That was another example where the father was always the bumbling idiot. And we know that, but we don't know where it came from. And it goes all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. Because before that, men worked alongside their families, their wives and children all day. And men were in contact with their sons virtually all day, training them in the adult skills that they would need. And so the Industrial Revolution took men out of the home. And of course, we took work out of the home, and then men had to follow their work out of the home into offices and factories. And we're so used to men being out of the home, we don't realize what a shock it was. But if you go back to the 19th century and you read the literature of the time, people were shocked at how the family was gutted, basically, by fathers being gone all day. And you'll see people protesting. One writer says, the greatest source of domestic sorrow these days is fathers not being there. Wow. Or another writer in the 19th century said, God is the father. And yet, the model of God, the Father, is gone now from the home, except on the weekends. We're used to it, but they were not. Or the leading psychologist of the day actually said, never before has the American boy been half orphaned. Half orphaned because, one half of the parental team was not there. Right. And so, in fact, without their father's supervision, boys did become... the behavior did get worse. People began to complain that boys were growing up being very wild and unruly and misbehaving. And when those boys grew up and moved from the farms into the cities, there's a huge increase in drinking, gambling, fighting, crime, gang activity, prostitution. All of this because these boys had been growing up without their father's, supervision. And so a lot of the negative traits that we associate with, quote unquote, toxic masculinity happened because the first generation of boys growing up without fathers, it had a huge increase in social pathologies. At any rate, that does also tell us what the solution has to be. It has to be reconnecting men to their children, and especially their sons. And so I do have a whole chapter on practical ways that we might be able to flex the workplace even today. And the pandemic was a game changer. Right. Harvard University did a study. It's not in the book because it just came out. But Harvard did a study, and they found that 68% of fathers said that during the pandemic, they got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that.
Wow.
They want some sort of hybrid setup, something that allows them to work from home part-time. So I think that's good. Fathers found out they liked being closer to their children. And there was a study done that I quote in the book on how effective are Christian parents at passing on their faith commitments, right? Their moral, spiritual convictions. It was a 35-year longitudinal study. It won all kinds of awards because it was a really good study. And they found two surprising things. Number one, they found that fathers matter more than women. Fathers matter more than mothers.
Right.
In other words, if the father is a committed Christian, the kids are more likely to follow him. If the mother is, she has an influence, just not as much.
Right.
Fathers have more influence, whether they want to or not.
Yeah.
Fathers have influence. But then secondly, they found that it only works if the father has a close, warm, loving relationship with his children. He can be a pillar of the church, a moral exemplar, perfect theology and doctrine. But if his kids see him as cold and distant, they won't follow him. They don't follow him. He has to have a warm, loving relationship. And what's interesting is that secular researchers found something similar. There was a study done just on how to raise masculine sons. Just that. How do we raise kids to be more masculine?
Right.
And the interesting thing is, once again, they said their finding was the father's own masculinity was irrelevant.
Wow.
Whether he was more of a tough guy or a gentle, his own masculinity was irrelevant. What mattered was the close, loving, warm relationship with his sons. His sons would have a confident, stable, secure sense of manhood if the father had a loving relationship with him.
Wow.
So again, the fathers matter. This is the upshot is, fathers, you make a much bigger difference than you may realize.
Yeah, that is truly fascinating. And I wonder if there's this yearn in society for that image to be restored of fathers. I'm just reminded of, I don't know if you've heard, it's a kids show called Bluey. It comes from Australia. And it's sort of skyrocketed. It's, I think, one of the most successful children's shows, and it's about a blue heeler parents, like two dogs, and they've got two kids, Bluey and Bandit. But the way they've constructed the identity of the father in this show is not one of the stereotypical, like Homer Simpson's, like Bandit, stupid sort of guy fumbling around, but it's a father who's engaged with his children and coming up with these activities and playing with them and wrestling and a lot of, I've got a 1-year-old daughter, and I've spoken to a number of my friends who have different children who have all watched the show, and they've been so encouraged by it because of the way it portrays a family. And I just wonder if that's why being part of its success is like what you're saying. It's sort of fed into this lost identity that fathers should be involved in their kids, should intentionally take steps to being intentional about their time with their children and invested into that. How do you think? Oh no, go for it.
Well, there was even a change in the Berenstain Bears, because there's about 50 or 60 books, right, in the series. And my son loved them, so I think we had them all. But for the first half, for a big chunk, the father was the bumbling idiot who was always the stupid one, and even the kids laugh at him and make fun of him. And and I hated this. I hated. And eventually, I guess there was enough negative feedback that they finally started treating the father with a little more respect. I remember the day that we picked up a book, and the father was the problem solver. Wow. Instead of the problem. The family had a problem, and he solved it. That's a first. So I thought, okay, something's getting through. And then, I don't know if you know this, but the son, the Berenstain Bears were by a couple, Jan and Stan Berenstain.
Right.
And they had a son who eventually worked with them and was an illustrator with them and so on. And then when both parents died, the son took over, and the son became a Christian.
Oh, wow.
His name was Mike Berenstain. His son became a Christian, and now he does his faith-based Berenstain Bear series.
What a turn of events.
That's a sign of how much hopefully the culture is shifting on this issue.
Yeah, that is.
Another sign of the shift. I'll give you another sign. Since my book came out, there's been another book it's called Of Boys and Men. And for the first time, it's a left-leaning author. He works at he's a researcher for the Brookings Institution, which is on the left. And up until now, all the books decrying, boys falling behind. The first one was by Christina Hoff Sommers. It was called The War on Boys. Right. And it was hugely controversial because, when men end up in the positions of power, they were told, and therefore we shouldn't help them at all. Any help you give boys is taking from girls. So it was very controversial. And so it became kind of identified as a conservative issue. And so this was the first time a book has been written on the subject by somebody who's leftist, who's liberal, works for the Brookings Institution. And it took a lot of courage for him to write the book, but he did it. And because of his leftist credentials, he's succeeding in getting this now finally a topic that you can talk about all across the political spectrum. And that's huge. I think that's very good. That it's Of Men and Boys by Richard Reeves, Reeves. And he's actually left the Brookings Institute to start his own organization to deal with boys and men, to propose, to do research and to propose programs that will help boys and men. So that is a really good sign of a sea change, that people are starting to say, yes, we do have to pay attention to our boys and men. We need to have compassion on them because they are falling behind. And we do need to have programs that are targeted to help them.
Very good. Yeah, it's an encouraging shift in perspective, and I think your book has been really formative in creating those conversations and bringing in that understanding as well that we need to be having in society. Just a final question would be, as we're talking about this, something that's come to my mind is how would you encourage young men who are perhaps struggling with these narratives of identity that they feel constrained to? How would you encourage them to sort of pursue real, authentic masculinity?
Yeah, so of course, I have a chapter on Jesus' masculinity, but what I think is even more important, because it's more overlooked, I should say, in the church, is the cultural mandate. Half my students have never even heard the term, but the cultural mandate is where you go back to Genesis, and God has created the universe and the planets and the stars, and he creates the first human couple. And what's the first thing he says to them? He tells them why he created them. What's their purpose? What's their job description? Be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth. And be fruitful and multiply doesn't just mean have kids, but of course, historically, all of the social institutions grow out of the family. The family becomes a clan, a tribe, a village, a nation. And you need specialized social institutions, like you need a state, you need a church, you need a school, you need a marketplace. And so when you unpack the very streamlined language of Genesis 1, when you unpack it, it really means men are called, men and women, but we're talking especially about men having a sense of purpose. Men are called to this very rich understanding of building up the whole social world. And then subdue earth means harness the natural resources. So, of course, it starts with agriculture, but mining and technology and building buildings and inventing computers and composing music. One of my students said, "Oh, come on, composing music?" So I said, "Well, I play the violin. What's the violin made out of? Wood.
Right.
What's the bow made out of? Horsehair." Sure. So all of the transcendent beauty that we associate with music does start with harnessing the raw materials of nature. And so this is really the calling that we should be imparting to young men. And this is a big enough vision to really fulfill their need to have an impact, to make a difference, to achieve, to accomplish mastery. I think too often in church, we think mostly of the spiritual goals. Go to church, read your Bible, raise your kids, in the admonition of the Lord, and those are very good. But men are also called to be culture creators. That's why people call this verse the cultural mandate, and theologians call it the cultural mandate, because what it means is we were called to build cultures, to build civilizations, to make history. It's a much bigger, richer understanding of the calling. I think that's what men are really hungry for. Is that some people think that the church feminizes men, and this would be a good counter to that. That no, it doesn't feminize them. It calls them to roll up their sleeves and get busy building up the social institutions and productive and creative work that benefits people. Glorifies God and benefits people.
Brilliant. Yeah, I love that, buying into that biblical narrative, that vision that is far bigger. I think so important. Well, your book's super encouraging. It's got a wealth of knowledge and information in it, and if people want to grab a copy of The Toxic War of Masculinity, it is readily available on Amazon. Are there any other ways that people can find it or connect with yourself?
Yeah, some people would prefer to patronize a Christian site, so you go to christianbook.com as well. And my publisher very generously redesigned my website, so it's fun and colorful now. So come on over to nancypearcey.com. Pearcey is Pearcey. Don't forget the second E. But you can browse my other books. You can see what else I've written. You can see who's endorsed them. And you can leave a message, too. I don't have time to answer all of them, but I read them. So come on by to nancypearcey.com and say hello.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and your generous sharing of knowledge and passion in a conversation that I think is really needed and relevant in today's culture. So thank you so much, Nancy, for everything that you've done to the lead up of this, all the research and time and hours spent sifting through all that data and producing a really amazing, encouraging book.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's good talking with you.
Yeah, you too. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.